The silence in the penthouse was a physical thing, a weight of polished chrome and chilled, recycled air that pressed down on Elian's chest. It was the sound of wealth, of isolation. From his perch on the low-slung divan, upholstered in a fabric that felt like solidified mist, he could see the whole of Aethelberg spread out below, a glittering circuit board of light and motion. Yet here, 60 stories above the thrum of the city, the only sound was the faint, electric hum of the environmental controls and the too loud beat of his own heart. He was a pearl in a hermetically sealed oyster, and he was suffocating. He lifted a hand, tracing the condensation his breath left on the floor-to-ceiling window. The glass was cold as everything else in this life he had been given. A life of curated beauty and profound emptiness. His gaze drifted to his own reflection, a pale, slender silhouette against the sprawling nebula of the metropolis. An omega, a mate. The words felt like labels on a specimen jar. They defined the shape of his existence, but not the substance of his soul. The scent of his mate, Rhys, was a ghost in the apartment. It clung faintly to the expensive linens in the bedroom they rarely shared, a crisp, sterile fragrance of ozone and bergamot, the scent of command and capital. It was the scent of a man who managed empires, not relationships. Rhys was a signature on a contract, a presence felt most keenly in his absence. The bond between them, forged in a sterile ceremony of flashing cameras and political handshakes, was a thin, cold wire stretched taut across the distance. It was a fact of his biology, a brand on his soul marked just below the curve of his neck. But it offered no warmth. It only tethered him. A soft chime echoed through the cavernous space, announcing an arrival at the private lift. Elian didn't move. It wouldn't be Rhys. Rhys's returns were announced days in advance by his schedulers, events to be prepared for, a performance to be staged. This would be someone else. A courier with another extravagant, impersonal gift. A technician for the building's myriad systems. Or him. The lift doors slid open with a whisper of displaced air, and a new scent bled into the sterile environment. It was a smell so profoundly different, so jarringly organic, that it felt like a violation. Petrichor and cedar, damp earth, and the sharp, clean promise of a storm. It was a scent that didn't belong in this world of polished metal and filtered air. It belonged to the wild, to the rain-soaked forests that were now just curated biodomes on the city's periphery. It was the scent of Kale, Rhys's younger brother. Kale stepped into the foyer, his form solid and broad in a way that seemed to absorb the ambient light. He wore the simple, functional clothing of an estate overseer, not the tailored, severe lines of his brother's corporate world. His dark hair was slightly damp, clinging to his temples, as if he'd just come in from a real rain, not the city's scheduled nutrient mists. He held a data slate in one hand, his gaze sweeping the room with a quiet, assessing intensity. He was the keeper of this place, the one who ensured the gilded cage remained in perfect working order. "Elian," he said. His voice was a low baritone, calmer than Rhys's clipped, authoritative tenor. It held a note of gravel, of earth. "Kale." Elian inclined his head, a gesture of polite acknowledgement that felt stiff and unnatural. He forced himself to remain still, to keep his breathing even. But it was a losing battle. The moment Kale's scent had filled the room, a traitorous hum had started deep within him, a low-frequency vibration in his bones. It was a primal, instinctual thrum of awareness that his conscious mind screamed to ignore. The hydroponics in the West Solarium are reporting a nutrient imbalance. I need to access the master control panel. He gestured vaguely towards a wall panel disguised as a piece of abstract art. Of course. Elian's voice was a breath, barely audible. He felt pinned by Kyle's presence, by the sheer, unignorable reality of him. While Reese was an idea, a concept of a mate, Kyle was a physical fact. He was heat and scent and solid mass. He was here. Kyle crossed the vast expanse of the living area, his boots making no sound on the plush, sound-dampening carpet. But Elian felt his approach as a shift in atmospheric pressure. The air grew thicker, warmer. The scent of rain and wood intensified, and with it, the strange, unsettling resonance in his blood. It was a feeling he'd become terrifyingly familiar with over the past few months, a deep, cellular pull towards this alpha, who was not his, an alpha whose genetic signature was so close to his mate's, yet so fundamentally, dangerously different in its effect on him. He watched Kale work, the fluid efficiency of his movements a stark contrast to Reese's calculated stillness. Kale's hands were not the manicured hands of a CEO. They were capable, marked with small scars and calluses, the hands of a man who fixed things. As he swiped his thumb across the panel, a cascade of holographic data shimmered in the air, casting a cool blue light on his focused expression. Elian's own hands clenched in his lap. He could feel it starting, a faint, phantom warmth spreading from his lower back, the precursor to a need he should not be feeling. Not for this man. His own scent, normally a placid, clean fragrance of white tea and linen, was threatening to shift, to sweeten with a note of distress, of invitation. He squeezed his eyes shut for a second, fighting it down, wrestling with his own biology. He was Reese's mate. The bond mark on his neck pulsed with a dull, proprietary ache, as if reminding him of his contractual obligation. But the body did not care for contracts. The body cared for presence, for resonance. And Kale's presence was a resonating chamber for every dormant instinct Elian possessed. "The system is recalibrating," Kyle said, his back still to him. "It should take a few minutes." "Thank you," Elian managed. The words were ash in his mouth. He should leave. He should retreat to the bedroom, put a closed door between them, douse himself in the scent-neutralizing spray that sat like a bottle of poison on his vanity. But he was frozen, a moth mesmerized by a strange, dark flame. Kyle turned, and his eyes, a deep, stormy grey, so like his brother's, but softer, more observant, met Elian's. For a moment, the polite fiction between them dissolved. He saw it in Kale's gaze, a flicker of something that mirrored his own turmoil, a flash of sharp, unwelcome awareness. His nostrils flared almost imperceptibly, and Elian knew, with a sickening certainty, that Kale could smell it. He could smell the traitorous shift in Elian's pheromones. He could smell the want. The silence stretched, no longer just empty space, but a field of crackling, unspoken energy. The hum of the city below seemed to fade to nothing. The only sound was the frantic drumming in Elian's ears, the whisper of Kyle's breath. Then Kyle's expression shuttered, the mask of calm professionalism snapping back into place. "I'll see myself out when it's done," he said, his voice once again flat and formal. He turned back to the glowing panel, a silent, unmovable dismissal. Elian finally found the strength to move. He rose from the divan, his limbs feeling heavy and disconnected. He walked towards the sanctuary of his bedroom, his bare feet sinking into the decadent carpet. He didn't look back. He couldn't. As he closed the bedroom door behind him, the click of the latch was a sound of finality, the sound of a cell door locking. He leaned against the cool wood, his body trembling. The scent of kale was still in the air, a ghost of the forest in his sterile prison. He brought a hand up to the mating mark on his neck. It felt like a brand, a symbol of a promise he was breaking with every treacherous beat of his heart. He remembered the ceremony with a cold, detached clarity. The great hall of the Nexus Tower, filled with the highest echelons of their society. Rhys at his side, a handsome, immovable statue in his formal blacks. Rhys's hand had been cool and dry around his. His scent, that ozone and bergamot scent of power, had been overwhelming, a clinical assertion of dominance. When Rhys had bent to mark him, the bite had been precise, efficient, and almost painless. A transaction. The bond had snapped into place not with a wave of euphoric connection that the poets wrote of, but with a cold, metallic click, the sound of a final sale. He had become Alien Vestergaard Thorn, an asset secured, a merger completed. He had felt nothing, a profound, hollow nothingness. He had told himself it was nerves. He had told himself the bond would warm with time, that the feeling would grow. It never had. And now, this terrible, vibrant, undeniable something he felt for his mate's brother. It was not a choice. It was an invasion, a hostile takeover of his senses, his instincts, his very cells. He pressed his forehead against the door, a wave of self-loathing washing over him. He was not just a prisoner in a gilded cage. He was a traitor. And the worst part, the part that truly terrified him, was the small, secret thrill that ran alongside the shame. The thrill of feeling something, anything, at all. Kyle stood before the shimmering data stream, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He wasn't looking at the nutrient levels or the pH balance of the hydroponic system. He was staring through them, his focus turned inward, wrestling with a storm of his own. The recalibration had finished minutes ago. The panel had chimed its soft, affirmative tone. But he hadn't moved. He couldn't. The scent, Elian's scent. It was everywhere. It had wrapped around him the moment he stepped out of the lift, a delicate fragrance of white tea and something else, something fragile and sweet like crushed blossoms. But it was the change that had frozen him. The subtle, almost imperceptible shift when their eyes had met. A new note had bloomed in the air, a whisper of honeyed musk, a pheromonal flag of dawning omega need. It was a scent that an alpha was biologically hardwired to respond to, and it was aimed with terrifying precision at him. He closed his eyes, his jaw tight. This was wrong. It was a violation on every level. Elian was his brother's mate. The bond was sacrosanct, the cornerstone of their societal structure. To even acknowledge what his senses were screaming at him was a betrayal of the highest order. Rhys trusted him. He had left the running of the family estate, the direct oversight of his own home, his own mate, in Kale's hands. And Kale, the dependable one, the quiet younger brother who lived in his brother's long shadow, was failing that trust in the most fundamental way imaginable. His own scent, the earthy petrichor he'd inherited from their father, a man of the land before the family had pivoted to technology, was spiking in response. He could feel the low growl rumbling in his chest, the instinct to answer that sweet, desperate call, to offer comfort, to stake a claim. He crushed it down with brutal force, a lifetime of practice in self-denial and control coming to his aid. He was not Reese. He was not the heir, the dominant alpha who took what he wanted. He was the second son, the recessive gene, the one who managed and maintained, who smoothed the way for his brother's ascent. He forced his fingers to uncurl. He had to get out. Now. He turned and walked towards the lift, his steps measured and heavy. He did not allow himself to glance towards the closed bedroom door, but he felt it, like a physical presence, a portal to a world of chaos he could not afford to enter. The air was still thick with that altered scent, and it was a physical effort to breathe, to keep it from sinking too deep into his lungs, from taking root in his mind. As the lift doors slid shut, sealing him in the small, sterile box, he finally allowed himself to exhale. The breath came out as a shudder. He leaned his head against the cool metal wall, the reflection that stared back at him, a stranger's face, pale and strained. He saw the conflict in his own grey eyes, the duty and the desire. He had first noticed it 3 months ago, a subtle thing. He had been calibrating the atmospheric filters in the main living space, and Elian had been arranging a vase of sterile, gene-spliced calla lilies that were delivered weekly. Elian had pricked his finger on a thorn, a cosmetic, blunted thorn, but it had been enough to draw a single, perfect drop of blood. And with the blood had come a flare of scent. Not pain, but distress. A raw, vulnerable pheromone that had hit Kale like a physical blow. He had dropped his tools, his entire being singularly focused on the source of that scent, on the slender Omega across the room. The instinct to go to him, to protect, to soothe, had been so overwhelming, it had left him dizzy. He had fled that day, mumbling an excuse about a system alert elsewhere. He had spent the rest of the day in the estate's lowest sub-level, surrounded by the hum of the geothermal converters, trying to purge the memory of that scent from his mind. He had failed. Since then, every interaction had been a tightrope walk over a canyon of instinct. He'd limited his visits, sent junior technicians for minor issues, communicated through sterile text messages. But there were things only he could do, systems only he had clearance for. And every time he had to come here, it grew worse. The pull grew stronger. Elian's scent seemed to be learning his, adapting to it, calling to it in a language older than words. The lift docked at the ground level with a soft thud. Kale stepped out into the grand, empty lobby of the residential tower. The air here was different, a neutral blend of filtered oxygen and the faint, anonymous sense of other residents. It was a relief, but the memory of the penthouse air clung to him. He knew what this was. He wasn't a fool. He'd read the same biological texts as any alpha. Bond incompletion, resonance attraction, rare, scandalous, destructive phenomena that were spoken of in hushed, clinical whispers. It happened when a primary bond was weak, emotionally or biologically. The Omega's instincts, left unfulfilled, could latch onto a secondary target, most often a close genetic relative of the bonded alpha, whose scent signature was similar enough to be familiar, but different enough to be novel, to be a potential better match. It was a biological failsafe, a cruel one. He walked out into the perpetual twilight of the city street, the towering buildings blocking out the sun. Reese's bond with Elian was weak. Kyle knew it. Everyone knew it. It was a political merger, not a love match. Reese was methodical, driven, and emotionally walled off. He likely saw his Omega as another beautiful acquisition, one that produced the correct social signals but required little personal maintenance. He probably hadn't spent enough time with Elian, hadn't saturated their shared space with his scent, hadn't performed the dozens of small, instinctual acts of reassurance and possession that cemented a true alpha-omega bond. Rhys had signed the contract and considered the job done, and he, Kale, had been left to pick up the pieces, to be the constant, steady presence, to inadvertently become the focal point for all of Elian's unfulfilled biological imperatives. A hovercar slid to a silent stop beside him. "Director Thorne," the automated voice chirped. "Your office?" Kale shook his head, waving it off. He needed to walk. He needed the illusion of open space, the bite of the city's damp air. He shoved his hands in his pockets and began to walk, his destination unknown. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. A line from some old text surfaced in his mind, nonsensical and out of place. He was Kale Thorne, the brother, the keeper, and he was walking into a disaster of his own making, one step at a time. The loyalty he felt for Rhys was a pillar of his identity, but the pull he felt towards Elian, that was something else entirely. It was a crack in the foundation, threatening to bring the whole structure of his life crashing down. 2 weeks passed in a haze of feigned normalcy. 2 weeks in which Elian perfected the art of living as a ghost in his own home. He ate the nutritionally balanced meals delivered by the automated kitchen. He walked the silent halls. He watched the city lights blink on and off, a rhythm as monotonous as his own breathing. He doubled his dose of scent neutralizer and took suppressants that left him feeling dull and disconnected, his emotions submerged under a chemical calm. It was a fragile peace, purchased at the cost of his own vitality. Rhys was due to return. His schedule, a complex holographic chart of meetings and travel itineraries, had been forwarded to Elian's personal terminal. He would be home for 48 hours, a domestic respite his scheduler had called it. For Elian, it felt like an impending audit. The day of his arrival, the apartment was filled with a flurry of activity that only highlighted its usual emptiness. Cleaners, invisible and efficient, polished surfaces that were already gleaming. A florist, a real person this time, arranged towering displays of exotic, scentless orchids. Rhys disliked overly fragrant flowers. He preferred a controlled environment. Elian dressed with care, selecting a soft, cream-colored tunic and trousers that were modest and elegant. He looked at his reflection in the dark mirror of the vanity. The suppressants had leached the color from his cheeks, leaving him looking ethereal and breakable. He looked like one of the orchids, beautiful, sterile, and bred for display. He felt a surge of something bitter and sharp, a feeling so potent it cut through the chemical fog. He quickly stamped it down. He had to perform. Rhys arrived precisely at 18 Wu. The lift doors opened and he stepped out, bringing with him the chill of the upper atmosphere and that clean, authoritative scent of ozone and bergamot. He was as immaculate as ever, his dark suit perfectly tailored, his hair styled with severe precision. He looked more like a corporation's avatar than a man. "Elian," he said, his voice smooth and cool. He didn't move to embrace him. Instead, his eyes did a quick, sweeping survey of the room, of Elian himself. An appraisal. "You look well." "Welcome home, Rhys," Elian replied, his own voice a practiced, gentle murmur. Rhys came forward and placed a chaste kiss on his forehead. The touch was dry and brief, a gesture devoid of heat. The bond between them gave a faint, obligatory thrum, like a plucked string on a poorly tuned instrument. Reese didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't care. "I have a gift for you," he said, turning to the aide who had followed him out of the lift. The aide, a beta with a perpetually nervous expression, handed Reese a flat, velvet-covered box. Reese presented it to Elian. "A little something I picked up in the Neo-Alexandria sector." Elian opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of black satin, was a collar. It was not a restraint, but a piece of jewelry, a delicate lattice of woven platinum and inset with tiny, glittering diamonds. It was exquisite. It was also a symbol of ownership, a beautiful, extravagant leash. "It's beautiful," Elian said, the words feeling like lies on his tongue. "Thank you." "It will suit you," Reese said, his tone one of satisfaction. He glanced at his wristcom. "We have dinner reservations at the Apex in an hour. Kyle will be joining us." The chemical calm in Elian's mind shattered. Kyle. The name was a stone, dropped into a still pond, the ripples spreading outwards, disrupting everything. He would have to sit across from Kale, with Reese at his side, and pretend. Pretend that his heart wasn't a frantic bird beating against the cage of his ribs. Pretend that his body didn't hum with a traitorous frequency whenever Kyle was near. "Is something wrong?" Reese asked, his sharp eyes catching the flicker of emotion on Elian's face. "You're pale." "No, nothing. I'm fine," Elian said quickly, forcing a small smile. "Just a little tired." "The suppressants," Reese stated, not as a question, but as a diagnosis. "You're taking the prescribed dosage?" "Yes." "Good. Can't have any disruptions." He said the word disruptions with a particular distaste, as if referring to a messy, inconvenient biological spill. He meant Elian's heat, an event that, in their 2 years of mated life, they had never shared. Reese was always away, or Elian was on a high enough dosage of suppressants to postpone it indefinitely. Their bond was a sterile contract, and a heat was too messy, too primal for the terms of their agreement. An hour later, they were seated in the hushed, exclusive restaurant at the very top of the city's tallest spire. The view was even more spectacular than from their apartment, a 360-degree panorama of the glittering cityscape. Kyle was already there, seated at their reserved table. He rose as they approached. He was wearing a dark grey suit, more formal than his usual attire, but still less severe than Reese's. It made him look solid, grounded, a piece of the earth amidst the cold starlight of the restaurant. His eyes met Elian's for a fleeting, unreadable moment before shifting to his brother. "Reese, you're back." "Kale." Reese clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture that was more a display of ownership than affection. "Good of you to join us." They sat. Reese at the head of the table, Elian on his right, Kale on his left. A perfect, symmetrical image of familial harmony. A complete and utter lie. The air was thick with unspoken things. Elian focused on the starched white linen of the tablecloth, on the precise arrangement of the silverware. He could feel Kyle's presence across the table like a source of heat. The scent of petrichor and cedar was muted by the restaurant's powerful air purifiers and Kale's own formal scent blocker, but Elian's senses, heightened and hungry, sought it out, found it clinging beneath the chemical overlay. Reese dominated the conversation, speaking of corporate acquisitions, of political maneuvering in off-world colonies, of the new line of androids his company was about to launch. He spoke to Kyle, but it felt like a briefing, a superior officer updating his subordinate. Kyle listened, his expression neutral, offering quiet, concise responses when required. He did not look at Elian. Elian felt himself shrinking, becoming invisible. He was the beautiful, silent ornament at the table. This was his role. This was the life he had been bound to. Then it happened. A waiter, a young, nervous-looking Omega, was pouring water. His hand trembled as he reached past Elian, and he fumbled the heavy crystal pitcher. Water, ice cold, splashed across the table and onto Elian's lap, soaking the front of his cream-colored trousers. He gasped, the shock of the cold making him jolt. "Clumsy fool," Reese snapped at the waiter, his voice like a whip crack. The young Omega flinched, his face paling, and began to stammer apologies. "It's all right," Elian said quickly, trying to diffuse Reese's anger. "It's just water." But before he could do anything else, a napkin was pressed into his hand. He looked up. Kyle was leaning across the table, his face etched with concern. His stormy grey eyes were fixed on Elian, all pretense of neutrality gone. "Are you all right?" Kyle asked, his voice a low, concerned rumble that cut through Reese's tirade, and then their fingers brushed. It was nothing, a fleeting, accidental contact of skin on skin. But for Elian, it was a lightning strike. A jolt of pure, unadulterated energy shot up his arm, straight to the core of his being. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The muted hum inside him roared to life, a deafening crescendo of need. His breath caught in his throat, his own scent, held in check by a cocktail of chemicals, broke free. A single, pure note of honeyed distress, of yearning, bloomed in the air around him. Time seemed to slow. He saw the flicker in Kale's eyes, the way his pupils dilated. He saw the subtle flare of his nostrils as he registered the scent. Kale's hand, which had been withdrawing, froze for a fraction of a second, his fingers pressing against Elian's. And Reese saw it all. His tirade against the waiter cut off abruptly. His head snapped towards them. His eyes, cold and sharp as shards of ice, narrowed. He didn't need to be a finely tuned alpha to sense the charge that had just passed between his brother and his mate. The shift in the atmosphere was undeniable. "What?" Reese said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level, "is going on?" The silence that followed was absolute. The waiter had fled. The ambient chatter of the restaurant seemed a universe away. There was only the three of them, trapped in a triangle of sudden, stark revelation. Elian snatched his hand back as if burned. Kyle leaned back in his chair, his face a mask of stone, but a muscle jumped in his jaw. Elian looked at his mate, at the cold, calculating fury building in his eyes. The audit had begun, and he had been found wanting. The ride back to the penthouse was a study in absolute zero. Reese sat beside Elian in the silent, automated vehicle, his body rigid, radiating a palpable cold. He had not spoken another word at the restaurant. He had simply settled the bill with a curt tap of his wristcom, risen, and walked out, leaving Kale sitting alone at the table. The command for Elian to follow had been unspoken, but absolute. Now, in the close confines of the car, the silence was a weapon. Reese stared straight ahead, his profile cut from granite against the fleeting city lights. The proprietary thrum of their bond had turned into a low, angry buzz, a warning signal of displeasure. Elian felt it as a headache building behind his eyes. He kept his own gaze fixed on his hands, clasped tightly in his still damp lap. The spot where Kale's fingers had touched his skin still burned. When they reached the apartment, Reese strode from the lift directly to the bar and poured himself a measure of some dark amber liquid. Elian remained standing in the center of the vast living room, feeling small and exposed under the cold, recessed lighting. "Take off the trousers," Rhys commanded, without turning around. Elian flinched. The order was flat, devoid of any emotion, but an icy authority. He hesitated for a moment before his fingers, clumsy and trembling, went to the fastening. He slipped them off, his legs suddenly bare and cold. He stood there in his long, cream-colored tunic, feeling deeply, profoundly humiliated. Rhys finally turned, swirling the liquid in his glass. His eyes raked over Elian, cold and clinical. "You smelled of him." It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact, a data point he had collected. "The waiter spilled water on me," Elian began, his voice thin. "Kyle was just—" "Do not lie to me," Rhys cut him off, his voice dangerously soft. "I am not a fool, Elian. I am a pragmatist. I deal in facts, and the fact is, my mate's scent altered in the presence of my brother. The fact is, the air between you could have powered a small city." He took a slow sip of his drink. Explain it. The demand was impossible. How could he explain a biological betrayal? How could he put words to the cellular treason that had taken root inside him? I don't know," he whispered, the words tasting like failure. "I don't control it." "You don't control it," Rhys repeated, a cruel smile touching his lips. "An Omega who cannot control his own scent. What a liability. I thought the suppressants were meant to handle such inconveniences." "They're not working as well anymore," Elian admitted, shame and fear making his stomach clench. "Clearly." Rhys set his glass down with a sharp click. He walked towards Elian, circling him slowly, like a predator assessing its flawed prey. The Vestergaard line was supposed to be pure, genetically stable. That was a key factor in our merger agreement. Your instability is a breach of contract. The words hit Elian harder than a physical blow. Merger agreement, breach of contract. He was nothing more than a faulty piece of technology, a disappointing asset. He was not a person. He was not a mate. He was a balance sheet entry that was failing to perform. "I am your mate," Elian whispered, a desperate plea for him to see, to understand. Rhys stopped in front of him. He reached out and tilted Elian's chin up with one cold finger. "You are my possession," he corrected him, his voice devoid of heat. "A beautiful, valuable possession that is currently malfunctioning, and I need to understand the nature of the malfunction." His eyes narrowed. "How long has this been going on with Kale?" Elian couldn't speak. A sob was caught in his throat. "How long?" Rhys insisted, his grip tightening slightly. "A few months," Elian choked out. "The feeling. I don't know why. It just happens when he's here." "When he is here," Rhys mused, releasing him. He began to pace. "My brother, the caretaker, the ever-present grounding force, while I am out building the empire that affords you this lifestyle." The irony was thick in his voice. "He smells of the earth, doesn't he? Something primal, something my polished, civilized scent can't offer." Elian stared at him, shocked by his cold, accurate assessment. "Oh, I know the biology," Rhys said, with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Resonance attraction. It occurs in cases of bond incompletion, a flaw in the system." He stopped pacing and pinned Elian with a look of pure, chilling calculation. "The flaw, then, is either in you or in me." He walked over to the disguised wall panel, the same one Kale had accessed. He pressed his palm to it, and a different interface shimmered to life. It wasn't the environmental controls. It was a medical diagnostic suite. "What are you doing?" Elian asked, a new kind of fear gripping him. "I'm running a diagnostic," Reese said calmly. "On the bond. It logs pheromonal compatibility, resonance frequency, biofeedback loops, every metric of our connection. I have it monitored, of course. All my assets are monitored. The holographic display filled with graphs and charts, a river of cold, hard data." Reese studied it, his expression unreadable. Elian felt stripped bare, his most intimate biological functions laid out like a corporate earnings report. "Interesting," Reese murmured after a long moment. He looked up from the data, his eyes glinting with a strange light. It wasn't anger anymore. It was something else, something that looked unnervingly like intellectual curiosity. "The bond is stable, legally and biologically sound. Your pheromonal output, however, shows significant deviation when in proximity to a secondary alpha of close genetic makeup, namely Kyle." He paused. "But the bond itself, it holds. There is no biological imperative for it to be superseded, which means the flaw, the instability, is you." He stepped away from the panel, his demeanor shifting. The cold fury was gone, replaced by the detached focus of a scientist observing a curious specimen. "This is a problem, but every problem has a solution." He walked back to Elian, his gaze intense. "We will correct this. We will reinforce the bond. Your heat is due in the next cycle, is it not?" Elian felt a tremor of pure terror run through him. I'm on suppressants." "You will stop taking them immediately," Reese commanded. "We will spend your heat together. Here, I will clear my schedule. I will anchor you. I will overwrite this anomalous resonance with my own. I will fix you." The words were a death sentence. The thought of spending days locked in this apartment, in the throes of a primal biological need, with this cold, clinical man. It was a violation worse than any he could imagine. His heat was the most vulnerable, most intimate part of his being. To have it used as a tool, a reprogramming software, was a desecration. "No," Elian whispered, the word escaping before he could stop it. Reese's eyes flashed with renewed anger. "No, you are in no position to refuse. You are my mate. Your body is my right. I will not have my legacy, my bloodline, tainted by whispers of instability and a weak bond. I will not be made a fool of by my own brother." He reached out and grabbed Elian's arm, his grip like steel. "You will do as you are told. You will be repaired. This discussion is over." He dragged Elian towards the bedroom, his purpose cold and absolute. Elian stumbled after him, his mind reeling, his heart a block of ice in his chest. This wasn't about connection. It wasn't even about desire. It was about control, about ownership. He was a malfunctioning asset, and Reese was going to force a system reboot. As the bedroom door closed behind them, Elian looked back at the glittering city beyond the window. It had never looked more like a prison. Kale sat alone at the table, long after Reese and Elian had departed. The half-empty glasses, the discarded napkins, the oppressive silence of the now-empty restaurant, they were all testament to the disaster that had just unfolded. He could still feel the ghost of Elian's skin against his, still smell the phantom trace of that sweet, desperate scent that had bloomed in the air like a forbidden flower. He had betrayed his brother, not with an action, not with a word, but with a feeling, with a biological response he couldn't control. And Reese had seen it. The cold, possessive fury in his brother's eyes had been unmistakable. Reese didn't tolerate flaws in his systems, and Kale and Elian had just revealed themselves to be the gravest of flaws. He finally pushed himself to his feet and left the restaurant, stepping out into the high-altitude chill. He didn't take a vehicle. He walked, descending through the city's levels on foot, moving from the sterile perfection of the upper spires to the more chaotic, crowded streets below. He needed the noise, the press of bodies, the grime. He needed to feel something other than the echoing silence of that dinner table. His wristcom chimed, a sharp, intrusive sound. It was Reese. Kale's thumb hovered over the decline button, but he knew it was pointless. Reese would not be ignored. He accepted the call. A hologram of Reese's head and shoulders shimmered into existence before him. His expression was cold, impassive. He was back in the penthouse, the familiar, sterile background, a stark contrast to the grimy street Kyle was on. "We need to talk," Reese said. No greeting, no preamble. "Reese," Kyle acknowledged, his own voice low and rough. "I have analyzed the situation," Reese continued, his tone that of a CEO delivering a quarterly report. "There is an instability in Elian's biological responses, a resonance anomaly triggered by your presence. It is a complication, but a manageable one." Kyle's stomach tightened. "What are you going to do?" "I am going to fix it," Reese stated simply. "I will be reinforcing our bond during his next heat cycle. I have cleared my schedule. By the end of it, this unfortunate distraction will be erased." The clinical coldness of the words made Kale's blood run cold. Reinforcing the bond, spending a heat. To Reese, it was a calibration, a software patch. To Elian, it would be a torment. Kale pictured Elian, fragile and pale, trapped with Reese's cold, methodical dominance for days on end. The protective instinct that roared inside him was so fierce it almost brought him to his knees. "You can't do that," Kale said, the words torn from him. Reese's hologram raised a single, elegant eyebrow. "I can't? He is my mate, Kale. It is my right, and my duty. It is the most efficient solution." "It's not about efficiency, Reese. He's a person, not a faulty server." "He is an asset that is underperforming," Reese countered, his voice dropping. "An asset you, it seems, have developed a dangerous interest in. I would advise you to remember your place, brother. You are the caretaker. You are not the owner. Your proximity is the source of the problem. Therefore, you will be removed from the equation." "What does that mean?" Kale asked, dread coiling in his gut. "Effective immediately. Your duties on the estate are terminated. You are to be reassigned. The hydro-forming project on Titan. It's a 5-year deployment. You'll leave at the end of the week. All your access codes to the Ethelberg residence will be revoked within the hour. Titan, a desolate, half-terraformed moon millions of miles away. It was an exile, a clean, efficient removal of the problematic variable. Reese wasn't just warning him away. He was excising him completely. "You can't be serious," Kale breathed, the scope of his brother's ruthlessness hitting him full force. "I am always serious when it comes to protecting my investments," Reese said. "Consider this a kindness. I'm giving you a way to avoid further complications, for you and for him." The hologram flickered. "Do not contact him. Do not attempt to see him. Your access is already gone. This is the last time we will speak of this. Goodbye, Kyle." The hologram vanished, leaving Kyle standing alone on the crowded street, the noise of the city fading into a dull roar in his ears. Exiled, cut off, Elian was alone with him, alone with a man who saw him as a faulty machine to be brutally reprogrammed. Kyle stood frozen for a long time, the stream of pedestrians flowing around him like a river around a stone. His mind raced. He had 1 hour. Less now. His access was being revoked. He could walk away. He could go to his own small apartment, pack his bags, and ship out to Titan. He could be the dutiful brother, accepting his punishment, allowing Reese to clean up the mess. It was the logical choice, the safe choice. It was what he had always done. But the image of Elian's terrified eyes at the dinner table burned in his mind. The feel of his trembling fingers, the scent of his distress. These were not data points. They were a plea. His entire life, he had lived in Reese's shadow, defined by his relationship to his brother. He was the spare, the backup, the manager. Reese was the sun, and Kale was a moon, reflecting his light, orbiting his power. To defy him was to break orbit, to spin off into the cold, empty darkness. But what was the alternative? To stand by and allow this monstrous correction to take place. To know that Elian was being subjected to a cold, loveless violation, all to smooth over a crack in Reese's perfect, orderly world. No, not this time. The decision, when it came, was not a logical one. It was a gut-level, instinctual certainty. It was the same instinct that had made him want to go to Elian when he pricked his finger. The same instinct that had made him lean across the table tonight. It was the instinct to protect. He turned and began to run, pushing through the crowds, his long legs eating up the pavement. He had to get back to the tower. His access was disappearing with every passing second. He didn't know what he would do when he got there. He had no plan. He only knew he could not leave Elian alone with him. He could not. He raced against the clock, against his brother's cold, calculated decree. He was no longer Kale Thorne, the caretaker. He was just Kale. And for the first time in his life, he was choosing his own trajectory. He was choosing to become a disruption. The bedroom was another cage within the larger prison. Reese had guided him inside with that unyielding grip on his arm, the pressure a constant reminder of his power. The door had closed with a soft, definitive click, engaging the privacy lock. They were sealed in. "Remove your tunic," Reese said, his voice as flat and emotionless as before. He was already shrugging out of his own suit jacket, folding it with meticulous care and placing it over a chair. He was preparing for a task, not an intimate encounter. Elian's fingers trembled as he pulled the tunic over his head, leaving him clad only in his briefs. The air, chilled to Reese's preferred temperature, raised goosebumps on his skin. He felt terribly vulnerable, exposed not just physically, but emotionally. His very being was laid bare for this cold, clinical inspection. Reese turned, his eyes scanning Elian's form. "Your scent is still chaotic. Notes of fear, distress, unacceptable." He walked to the ensuite bathroom and returned with a small, sterile-looking vial. "This will flush the suppressants from your system more quickly. It will induce the heat cycle within 12 to 24 hours. Elian stared at the vial, at the clear liquid within. It looked like poison. "Reese, please," he begged, his voice cracking. "Don't do this. This isn't right." "What is right is the preservation of our bond and the stability of my household," Reese retorted, uncapping the vial. "Your romantic notions are irrelevant. This is a biological necessity, a reset. Now hold still." He moved towards Elian, the vial held ready. Panic, pure and primal, surged through Elian. This was it. This was the point of no return. He was about to be chemically forced into his most vulnerable state, to be used as a tool by a man who felt nothing for him but a sense of frustrated ownership. He did the only thing he could. He scrambled back, away from Reese, his bare feet slipping on the polished floor. No, the word was a shout this time, raw and ragged. Reese stopped, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his features. He was not accustomed to being defied. Do not be a child, Elian. I am not a child, and I am not a machine you can just reset. Elian's voice rose, filled with a desperate strength he didn't know he possessed. This bond, our bond, it's empty, Reese. It has always been empty. Can't you feel it? It's just a contract. It's not real. It is the only reality that matters, Reese said, his patience wearing thin. His calm was finally cracking, revealing the cold fury beneath. And you will submit to it. He lunged for Elian. Elian dodged, his heart hammering against his ribs. The vast, minimalist bedroom had become an arena. He backed away, putting the large, low bed between them. You can't force this, he cried. It won't work. It will only make it worse. It will work because I will make it work, Reese snarled, his alpha nature finally surfacing, raw and dominant. His scent sharpened, the ozone smell acquiring a metallic, threatening edge. I am your alpha. You will obey. He vaulted over the bed with a fluid, predatory grace that was terrifying. Elian had nowhere left to run. He was cornered against the cold glass of the window, the glittering city a mocking backdrop to his terror. Reese grabbed him, his hands biting into the soft flesh of Elian's upper arms. He was immensely strong. Elian struggled, but it was useless. He was a bird in a hawk's talons. Hold. Still, Reese gritted out, bringing the vial up towards Elian's neck, aiming for the injection point near his scent gland. Elian twisted his head away, a guttural sound of pure terror escaping his throat. He could smell the chemical sharpness of the liquid. He was seconds away from being plunged into a nightmare. And then a loud, violent thud echoed from the living room. It was the sound of the apartment's main door being forced. Reese froze, his head snapping towards the bedroom door. What in the hell? A second thud, louder this time, followed by the screech of tortured metal. The security systems, which should have been impenetrable, were being overridden or overpowered. A chime, sharp and frantic, sounded from Reese's wrist comm. An alert. Perimeter breach. Unauthorized entry. Zone 01. Reese's grip on Elian loosened in his shock. In that split second of distraction, Elian shoved against his chest with all his might. Caught off balance, Reese stumbled back a step. It was all the opening Elian needed. He scrambled away, diving behind the bed again, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The sound of the front door giving way was unmistakable. A loud, rending crash that echoed through the silent penthouse. Heavy footsteps pounded across the living room floor. "Kyle!" Reese roared, his voice filled with disbelief and murderous rage. He instantly knew who it was. Who else could have the knowledge to even attempt to bypass his security? Who else would dare? The bedroom door, locked and reinforced, shuddered in its frame. A fist hammered against it. Elian, Kyle's voice, muffled but clear, roared through the door. "Elian, are you all right?" Relief, so potent and overwhelming it almost buckled Elian's knees, flooded through him. "Kyle." He came back. "I'm here," Elian cried out, his voice choked with tears. "He's trying to—" Reese moved with blinding speed. He crossed the room and clamped a hand over Elian's mouth, silencing him. "You will be silent," he hissed in his ear, his body pressing Elian back against the wall. His other hand still held the vial. Outside, Kyle's voice was a low, dangerous growl. "Reese, open this door. Open it now, or I swear to every god you don't believe in, I will tear it from its hinges." "You have lost your mind, little brother," Reese called back, his voice tight with contempt. He was still pressing Elian against the wall, a human shield. "You have just thrown your entire life away. For what? For a malfunctioning Omega who is my property." "He is not your property," Kyle roared, and the door shuddered again under a powerful blow. A crack appeared in the composite material near the lock. Reese looked at the cracking door, then at the terrified Omega in his grasp. A cold, cruel smile twisted his lips. He saw a new way to win, a new way to assert his control. "You want to see what happens to things that belong to me?" Reese yelled towards the door. Then he looked down at Elian, his eyes gleaming with a terrible light. "You want to see how I fix what is broken?" Before Elian could react, Reese jabbed the vial against his neck and depressed the plunger. A sharp, cold sting, and then a burning fire spread through Elian's veins. The world tilted, colors smearing at the edges of his vision. He felt a deep, seismic shift in his own body, a chemical key turning a lock deep inside him. The suppressants were being purged, the heat was being summoned. He gasped, his body going limp in Reese's hold. The last thing he saw before his vision swam was the bedroom door splintering inwards and Kale's face, a mask of pure, unrestrained fury, appearing in the opening. Kale saw red. The world narrowed to a single point of focus, his brother holding Elian, and the empty vial falling from Reese's hand. He understood instantly what Reese had done. He had triggered the heat. He had started the clock on his brutal reprogramming. A guttural roar of pure alpha rage ripped from Kale's throat, a sound he had never made in his life. It was primal, territorial, and utterly lethal. He launched himself through the ruined doorway, his only thought to get Reese's hands off Elian. Reese, anticipating the attack, shoved Elian away from him. Elian stumbled and collapsed onto the soft rug, his body already starting to tremble with the first effects of the hormonal accelerant. Reese turned to face his brother, his own alpha nature now fully unleashed. The air in the room crackled, thick with the clashing sense of two dominant alphas on the verge of violence. Ozone and metal versus petrichor and thunder. "You are a fool," Reese snarled, his civilized veneer completely stripped away. He was all sharp edges and predatory intent. "You have no idea what you've done." "I know what you've done," Kyle shot back, his fists clenched, his body coiled like a spring. "You'd poison him, force him, just to prove a point, just to fix a line on your balance sheet." "He is mine," Reese roared, the word a physical force. "Our bond gives me that right. A bond you never honored, a bond you treated like a corporate merger." Kyle took a step forward. "You left him to rot in this cage, and you're surprised his instincts reached for something real." The truth of the words hit Reese like a physical blow. His face contorted in a mask of fury. He didn't argue. He attacked. He moved with the deadly precision he applied to everything. A short, sharp jab aimed at Kale's throat. Kale, who had grown up sparring with his older, stronger brother, anticipated it. He deflected the blow, the force of it jarring his arm to the shoulder. They crashed together, a tangle of limbs and fury. It wasn't a graceful fight. It was brutal and raw, fueled by years of resentment and a lifetime of unspoken rivalry, now ignited by the most primal trigger of all, an Omega in distress. They slammed against the wall, knocking a piece of minimalist art to the floor, where it shattered. Reese was faster, more technical. Kyle was stronger, his power drawn from a deeper, more elemental well. He fought with the desperation of a man who had nothing left to lose. From the floor, the world was a dizzying, terrifying blur to Elian. The sounds of the fight, the grunts of effort, the sickening thud of fists on flesh, the snarled curses, were muffled as if coming from underwater. A fever was building inside him with unnatural speed. His skin felt too tight, his blood like lava in his veins. A low moan escaped his lips. His scent, no longer held in check, began to pour into the room. It was a scent of pure, undiluted heat, honey and musk, and a deep, sweet floral note of utter surrender. But it was laced with the sharp, acrid tang of terror and pain. It was a contradictory signal, a call for a mate and a cry for help all at once. The scent hit the two fighting alphas like a bomb. Both of them faltered. Reese, who was trying to get Kyle into a chokehold, gasped, his eyes glazing over for a second with raw, possessive lust. Kyle staggered back, his head swimming, the dual instinct to fight his rival and go to the Omega, tearing him in two. It was Reese who recovered first. His obsession with control was, in its own way, a powerful anchor. He saw the conflict in Kale's eyes, saw his brother's attention being pulled towards Elian. He used it. Reese drove a knee into Kale's stomach, hard. Kale doubled over, the air driven from his lungs. Reese didn't press the attack. He turned his attention to the real prize. He looked at Elian, curled on the floor, his body trembling, his scent a thick, intoxicating cloud. "The cycle has begun," Reese said, his voice husky, a strange, feverish light in his eyes. "Now we finish this." He started towards Elian, his intent clear. He was going to claim him, to mark him again, to use the height of his biological vulnerability to scorch Kale's influence from their bond forever. Kale, gasping for breath, saw Reese's movement. He saw the look on his brother's face, the predatory gleam of possession, and he saw the absolute terror in Elian's wide, fever-bright eyes. Elian wasn't looking at Reese with need. He was looking at him as if he were a monster. In that moment, everything became clear for Kale. This wasn't a fight for dominance. It wasn't about which alpha was stronger. It was about saving Elian. With a final, desperate surge of strength, Kale lunged, not at Reese, but past him. He threw himself between Reese and Elian, creating a human barrier. He landed on his knees before the trembling Omega, turning his back on his brother. It was a statement, a surrender of the fight, and a declaration of his true priority. "Don't touch him," Kale growled, his voice low and shaking, not with rage anymore, but with a fierce, protective certainty. He didn't look at Reese. His eyes were on Elian, on the pain and fear etched on his beautiful face. Reese stood frozen, staring at his brother's back. He was staring at the ultimate betrayal. Kale wasn't trying to steal Elian. He was shielding him. He had placed the Omega's well-being above his own safety, above their rivalry. In the primal language of their biology, it was the most profound statement an alpha could make. "You would choose him? Over your own blood," Reese whispered, his voice laced with a venomous disbelief. Kale reached out a trembling hand, not to touch Elian, but just holding it in the space near him, an offering of safety. "He is not a thing to be won, Reese. He is a person who is terrified of you." The words hung in the air, more devastating than any physical blow. Elian, his mind clouded by the fog of his rapidly accelerating heat, focused on Kyle's face. He saw no lust there, No possessive fire like the one he'd seen in Reese's eyes. He saw only a deep, aching concern. He saw his own fear reflected in Kale's pained expression. Instinctively, he leaned towards that safety. He reached out, and his fingers brushed against Kale's. That small touch, in the superheated, pheromone-thick atmosphere of the room, was a definitive choice. A sound, something between a sob and a snarl, broke from Reese. He looked at his brother shielding his mate. He looked at his mate reaching for his brother. He saw the tableau of his defeat. His perfect, orderly world had not just been cracked, it had been shattered, and the pieces could not be reassembled. He was a pragmatist. He knew when a negotiation had failed, when an asset was irrevocably lost. To continue this fight would be messy, public, and ultimately a loss. There was no fixing this, not anymore. With a final, chillingly calm expression, Reese straightened his disheveled suit. He smoothed his hair back. The mask of the cold, controlled CEO snapped back into place, covering the raw alpha beneath. "Fine," he said, the word as cold and sharp as a shard of glass. "Have him. Have each other." He bent and retrieved the platinum and diamond collar from where it had fallen during the fight. He held it for a moment, then let it drop to the floor with a soft, final clatter. "You have broken the contract, both of you. The asset is corrupted. I am divesting." He turned and walked out of the bedroom, his back ramrod straight. He did not look back. He walked through the wreckage of the living room, past the ruined front door, and stepped into the lift. The doors slid shut, and he was gone. Silence descended, a profound, echoing silence, broken only by Elian's ragged, feverish breaths. The fight was over, but the real crisis had just begun. The chemically induced heat was taking hold, a raging inferno with no way to stop it, and Elian was trapped in the middle of it, with the one man his body craved more than anything, the man who had just sacrificed everything for him. He was free from Reese, but he was now a prisoner of his own biology, and Kale was locked in with him. The silence left in Reese's wake was heavier than the preceding violence. It was a vacuum filled with the scent of blood, sweat, and the overpowering, sweet and acrid perfume of Elian's forced heat. Kale remained on his knees, a statue of tense stillness, his back to the door, shielding Elian from a threat that was already gone. The adrenaline of the fight began to recede, leaving behind a deep, aching thrum in his bruised knuckles and a hollow sense of dread in his gut. He had won. He had driven his brother away, and in doing so, he had trapped himself in the heart of the storm. "Elian," he whispered, his voice rough. He slowly turned his head, his movements careful, as if approaching a frightened animal. Elian was curled into a tight ball, his arms wrapped around his stomach, his body racked with violent tremors. A sheen of sweat glowed on his pale skin. His eyes, wide and unfocused, were pools of fevered panic. The heat wasn't a gentle wave of need. It was a hostile, chemical assault, a fire burning through him without the slow build, the natural preparation. Reese's solution had been an act of profound cruelty. "It hurts," Elian gasped, the words barely audible. "Kale, it hurts." The sound of his name on Elian's lips, a desperate plea, cut through Kale's own turmoil. The alpha instinct to claim, to possess, was a roaring furnace in his blood, fueled by the thick, intoxicating scent in the air. But it was tempered by something stronger, the desperate, overwhelming need to soothe the pain he saw in Elian's eyes. I know, Kyle said, his voice a low, calming rumble. I know. I'm here. He needed to think. The estate's automated systems detecting the pheromonal spike of an unsuppressed heat would have already initiated lockdown protocols. They were sealed in. No one could get in, and they could not get out. Not until the heat had run its course, which could be days. Days of this. Days of aliens suffering through a chemically induced fever, and Kyle fighting a war against his own biology. He forced himself to stand, his body screaming in protest. He had to establish some semblance of control over the situation, or they would both be lost to the storm. First, Elian's safety, his comfort. The bedroom was a wreck, a testament to the violence that had erupted there. It felt wrong, unsafe. He needed to create a sanctuary, a nest. It was the most primal of Omegaverse instincts for an alpha to build a safe, soft place for an omega in heat. To do so now felt like crossing another, more intimate line. But to leave Elian shivering on the cold floor was unthinkable. I'm going to move you, Kale said softly, projecting calm he did not feel. I'm going to take you to the living room. Is that okay? Elian gave a small, jerky nod, his eyes squeezed shut against a wave of pain. Kale bent and slid his arms under Elian's body, one under his knees, the other supporting his back. Elian was light, almost weightless, but he was radiating a staggering amount of heat. As Kale lifted him, Elian instinctively curled against his chest, burying his face in the crook of Kyle's neck. A desperate, keening sound escaped him. The direct contact, the press of Elian's hot skin against his, the full, unmediated blast of his scent directly at Kyle's own scent glands was a physical shock. Kyle's world dissolved into pure, overwhelming sensation. Honey, musk, and terror. His fangs ached in his gums. The growl that rumbled in his chest was a possessive, claiming sound. He fought it down with every ounce of his willpower, his jaw so tight it felt like it might crack. He was not Reese. He would not be a monster. He carried Elian out of the ruined bedroom and into the vast, silent living area. The floor-to-ceiling windows showed the city glittering with an indifferent beauty. He gently laid Elian down on the enormous, soft divan. Elian immediately curled back into a ball, whimpering. "I'll be right back," Kyle promised, and his voice strained. He moved through the apartment with purpose, gathering every soft thing he could find. The expensive cashmere throws from the chairs, the plush, oversized pillows from the guest rooms. He stripped the bed in the master suite, taking the fine, high-thread count sheets and the down-filled duvet, leaving Reese's side of the bed bare. He brought it all to the living room, piling it onto and around the divan, his movements driven by an instinct he didn't fully understand, but couldn't deny. He was building a nest, a soft, enclosed space in the center of the cold, sterile apartment. As he worked, he stripped off his own torn and dirtied suit jacket, then his shirt, until he was bare-chested. He needed his own scent to be a part of this. Not the aggressive, combative scent from the fight, but his core scent. The smell of damp earth and cedar. The scent Elian's body had been calling for. He added his shirt to the pile of bedding, letting his pheromones permeate the soft fabrics. It was an act of profound intimacy, marking the territory not with aggression, but with an offering of comfort. When he was done, a soft, sprawling nest of pale fabrics occupied the center of the room. It looked like an island of warmth in a sea of chrome and glass. He went back to Elian, who was shaking more violently now, his teeth chattering despite the heat pouring from his body. Elian, Kyle said, his voice gentle. Can you move to the nest? It will be warmer. Elian looked at the pile of soft things, his fever-bright eyes full of confusion. Then his gaze fell on Kyle's bare chest, on the bruises already purpling on his skin from the fight. He saw the raw concern on Kyle's face. He saw the protector. Slowly, painfully, he crawled from the divan into the heart of the nest Kyle had built. He burrowed into the pillows and duvets, the soft fabrics a small comfort against his hypersensitive skin. He inhaled, and for the first time, the scent in the air was not just his own panicked heat, but something else. It was the scent of Kyle's shirt, the scent of Kyle himself. Earth and rain. It was grounding, calming. Kyle watched him, his heart aching. The nest was not enough. An omega in heat needed the presence of an alpha, the calming pheromones, the body heat, the steady heartbeat. To deny him, that would be its own form of cruelty. He made a decision. He would give Elian what his body needed for survival, but he would not take what his own body craved. He would be a guardian, not a claimant. Slowly, deliberately, Kale lowered himself into the nest. He didn't lie beside Elian, but sat near the edge, his back against the arm of the divan, creating a solid, warm wall. He was present, but not encroaching. He let his own calming pheromones loose, consciously smoothing out the aggressive edges, offering a steady, grounding scent of cedar and quiet earth. Elian sensed the shift immediately, the change in the pheromonal landscape. The aggressive, terrifying pressure of the room began to ease, replaced by a steady, warm presence. The frantic edge of his need softened slightly. The pain was still there, a fire in his veins, but it was no longer a solitary agony. He uncurled just a little, turning his head to look at Kale. Kale's face was grim, his jaw set, his eyes focused on some distant point across the room. He was fighting his own battle, a war of control that was evident in the tense set of his shoulders, the corded muscles in his neck. He was suffering, too, for him. A wave of emotion, so powerful it transcended the fire of the heat, washed over Elian. Gratitude, awe, a deep, resonant connection that had nothing to do with pheromones and everything to do with the soul. Kyle, he whispered. Kyle's head turned, his stormy grey eyes meeting Elian's. Thank you, Elian breathed. A muscle jumped in Kyle's jaw. He gave a short, sharp nod, unable to trust his voice. The first wave of the heat crested, and Elian cried out, his back arching. It was a wave of pure, agonizing need. His body screamed for a mate, for a knot, for the biological release that would end the torment. He writhed in the nest, the sheets twisting around him. Kale didn't move. He held his position, a rock in the storm, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists on his knees. He breathed through the instinct to go to Elian, to pin him down, to claim him, to answer the call. He breathed through it, and on the exhale, he pushed out more of his calm, steadying scent. I am here. You are safe. I will not hurt you. Elian felt it. Through the haze of pain and need, he felt Kale's control. He felt his protection, and he understood the monumental effort it was costing him. Reese would have taken him by now. Reese would have used this moment to dominate and possess. Kale was holding back. He was honoring him, even in this most primal of moments. As the first wave receded, leaving him trembling and exhausted, Elian did something instinctual. He shifted in the nest, moving closer to Kale's warmth. He didn't touch him, but he rested his head on a pillow just inches from Kale's thigh. It was a gesture of absolute trust. Kale looked down at the top of Elian's head, at the damp, dark curls clinging to his forehead. He could feel the heat rolling off him in waves. His own body was a taut wire of unfulfilled instinct. But seeing Elian's small movement of trust, that quiet, voluntary closing of the distance between them, was an anchor. It was a reminder of what he was fighting for. Not to possess Elian, but to give him a choice, to give him a moment of peace in the middle of the fire. The long night began. A night of cresting waves of pain and need, of whispered words of comfort, of a shared, torturous vigil. In the heart of the sterile penthouse, in a makeshift nest of silk and cashmere, a different kind of bond was being forged. Not with a bite or a claim, but with restraint, with sacrifice, with the quiet, unshakable presence of one man refusing to let the other suffer alone. The next 36 hours blurred into a timeless, feverish fugue. The city outside the windows went through its cycles of light and dark, but inside the penthouse, time was measured only in the waves of Elian's heat and the depths of Kyle's endurance. The air was so thick with pheromones, it felt like a liquid, a heady, intoxicating soup of need and control, of pain and comfort. Kale did not leave the nest. He dozed in fits and starts, sitting upright, his back against the divan, a sentinel guarding a sacred fire. His body ached with a deep, primal tension that was a constant, grinding agony. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to take what was being so powerfully offered, to claim the Omega writhing in a delirium of need just inches from him, to bury himself in that heat and find his own release. But every time he looked at Elian's face, contorted in pain from the unnatural, accelerated cycle, he found a new reserve of strength. This was not a seduction. It was a rescue. He talked to Elian through the worst of it, his voice a low, steady murmur. He didn't use words of passion or desire. He told him about the forest he remembered from childhood before the city had swallowed everything. He described the smell of real soil, the feel of rough bark, the sound of wind in the pine trees. He spoke of stars seen from outside the city's light pollution, a blanket of infinite cold diamonds. He grounded Elian in a world outside this room, outside his own body's torment. And Elian, in his lucid moments between the waves, clung to the sound of Kyle's voice. It was an anchor in the raging sea of his senses. He learned the landscape of Kyle's soul through those quiet stories, a landscape that matched the scent of petrichor and cedar that now filled his world. He was falling in love, not with an alpha, but with a man. He was falling in love with his quiet strength, his gentle heart, his unwavering respect. During the second night, the fever peaked. Elian was delirious, his body burning. He cried out, not with need anymore, but with sheer pain. "Make it stop," he begged, his voice a raw, broken thing. "Please, Kyle, make it stop." Kyle's control finally broke, not in a wave of lust, but in a surge of compassion. He couldn't let him suffer like this. He shifted in the nest, moving closer. "Elian," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "let me help you. Just let me hold you." Elian's fever-bright eyes focused on him, a glimmer of terrified lucidity in their depths. He was afraid Kale would become Reese. "I will not claim you," Kyle swore, his voice a raw oath in the silent room. "I will not hurt you. I swear on my life, Elian. I just want the pain to stop." He reached out, not with a grasping hand, but with an open palm, an invitation. After a long, shuddering moment, Elian leaned into the touch. He pressed his burning forehead into Kyle's palm. The contact was electric, but it wasn't the lightning strike of forbidden desire from the restaurant. It was the closing of a circuit. It felt like coming home. With infinite gentleness, Kyle gathered Elian into his arms. He pulled the trembling Omega against his chest, cradling him. Elian was fire and bone, his heart hammering against Kale's ribs. Kyle wrapped his arms around him, holding him securely, and began to release his pheromones in a steady, concentrated stream. Not just the calming scent of cedar, but the deeper, more potent alpha scent of reassurance, of protection, of presence. You are safe. You are cared for. I am here. I am with you. It was the most intimate act of his life, more intimate than any sexual encounter could ever be. He was sharing his very essence, his core alpha nature, for the sole purpose of healing. Elian sagged against him, a deep sob breaking from his chest. It was a sound of pain, but also of release. He breathed in Kyle's scent, and it was like drinking cool water after days in the desert. It didn't quench the fire of the heat, but it soothed the burns. It pushed back the panic. It told his frantic, fevered body that a mate was here, that he was not alone, that he was safe. He wrapped his own arms around Kale's neck, clinging to him, and for the first time in 2 days, his body began to relax. The violent tremors eased into a low-grade shiver. The frantic edge of his need softened into a deep, aching pulse. He was still in heat, but he was no longer in agony. He was being held. He was being sheltered. They stayed like that for hours, Kyle holding Elian, rocking him gently, murmuring to him as the final, most intense waves of the heat washed over them. Kyle's body was a screaming chorus of denial, but his will was iron. He focused on the feeling of Elian's breathing, slowly evening out, on the way Elian's hands were fisted in his hair, on the absolute trust Elian had placed in him. Sometime near dawn on the 3rd day, the fever broke. The raging fire in Elian's blood banked, receding into embers. The violent, desperate need subsided, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion and a quiet, resonant ache. The heat was over. Elian stirred in Kyle's arms, his mind slowly clearing from the fog. He felt weak, drained, but the pain was gone. He was lying curled against Kyle's bare chest, Kyle's arms a warm, solid cage around him. The air was still thick with their combined scents, but it was no longer a maelstrom. It was a new atmosphere, a unique biome they had created together. Petrichor and white tea, cedar and honey. It smelled like them. He tilted his head back. Kyle was awake, watching him. His face was shadowed with exhaustion, his eyes bruised with fatigue. But the expression in them was one of soft, gentle relief. "It's over," Kyle whispered. "You stayed," Elian said, his own voice a hoarse rasp. "I told you I would," Kyle replied simply. A new silence fell between them, but this one was not empty. It was filled with the weight of what they had just endured. The violence, the fear, the intimacy, the restraint. They had been to the very edge of their biology and had chosen something else. They had chosen each other, not as Alpha and Omega, but as Kale and Elian. Elian lifted a hand and gently touched the dark bruise blooming on Kale's cheekbone, a gift from Reese. "He hurt you." Kale caught his hand, his fingers warm and calloused around Elian's. He brought Elian's palm to his lips and pressed a soft, reverent kiss into its center. "It doesn't matter." In that moment, looking into Kyle's tired, earnest eyes, Elian knew he was irrevocably, completely in love. It was a feeling so pure and certain, it felt like the only true thing in the universe. A soft chime echoed through the apartment. It was a sound they hadn't heard in days. A signal. Kyle's head lifted. "The lockdown," he said. "It's been lifted." The system, no longer detecting the crisis levels of pheromones, had returned to normal. They were no longer trapped. They were free. But free to do what? To go where? Reese had cut them off. Kyle had been exiled. Elian was still, legally and biologically, Reese's mate. The mark on his neck, though faint, was still there. A ghost of a chain. They were free from the prison of the heat, but now they had to face the reality of the world outside. The aftermath of the storm was a profound quietude. Bathed in the soft light of morning filtering through the panoramic windows, the penthouse felt less like a prison and more like a wreckage site. The discarded, diamond-studded collar glinting on the bedroom floor, the splintered doorframe, the nest of tangled sheets and pillows saturated with the history of the last 3 days. It was a space transformed by trauma and tenderness. Elian felt transformed too. He was hollowed out, physically drained, but a new, quiet strength was settling in his bones. He sat wrapped in a soft robe Kyle had found for him, sipping a glass of water that Kyle had brought. His hands were steady. The chemical fog in his mind was gone, replaced by a stark, unnerving clarity. Kale moved about the apartment with a quiet purpose, his movements stiff and bruised. He found a medical kit and began to methodically clean the cut on his lip, the scrapes on his knuckles. He did it with a detached efficiency, but Elian could see the weariness in the slump of his shoulders. He had paid a physical price for Elian's safety. "What happens now?" Elian asked, his voice still raspy but clear. Kale paused, dabbing an antiseptic wipe on his knuckles. He looked at Elian, his grey eyes serious. "Now, we get you out of here." "Out? To where?" The question hung in the air. Elian had no money of his own, no resources. Everything he had, everything he was, had been tied to Reese. Kyle had just been fired and exiled. They were adrift. "I have a place," Kyle said. "It's not this." He gestured around the opulent penthouse. "It's small. It's in the lower levels. But it's mine. And it's safe." He met Elian's gaze. "And you will not be alone." The simple promise was everything. You will not be alone. It was the opposite of his entire life with Reese. But there was still the matter of the bond. "Reese," Elian began, his hand instinctively going to the faint mark on his neck. "The bond is still there. He can track me through it. He can exert his rights." "He won't," Kyle said, with a certainty that surprised Elian. "I know my brother. He's a creature of profit and loss. To him, you are now a corrupted asset. Forcing a claim on you now, especially after what happened, would be a public relations nightmare. It would be messy, illogical. He'll want a clean break. He'll want to erase the loss from his ledger." "A dissolution," Elian breathed. A bond dissolution was a rare and scandalous procedure, a formal severing of the alpha-omega connection, both legally and biologically. It was painful and humiliating for all involved. "It's the most pragmatic solution," Kale said, echoing Reese's own favorite word. "It allows him to control the narrative, the unstable Omega, the treacherous brother. He will paint us as villains, cut his losses, and move on. He values his reputation for cold, logical control far more than he ever valued you." The words should have hurt, but they didn't. They were liberating. To be a loss to Reese was to be free of him. But the dissolution process, Elian hesitated. "It requires the consent of all 3 parties, him, me, and the alpha creating the resonance challenge. Kyle looked at him, his expression unreadable. "Yes." "Will you consent?" Elian asked, his heart in his throat. It was the real question. Consenting would mean formally declaring himself as the reason for the bond's failure. It would mean public shame, permanent blacklisting from the society he'd grown up in. It would mean finalizing the break with his family, his fortune, his entire life. Kale walked over to him. He crouched down so they were at eye level. The scent of cedar and rain was a part of him now, a scent of safety and home. "Elian," he said, his voice low and intense. "I walked back into this building knowing I was throwing my life away. I broke down that door knowing I would lose everything, my brother, my inheritance, my future, and I would do it again. I would do it 1,000 times. He reached out and gently touched Elian's cheek, his thumb stroking the soft skin. "Consenting to this dissolution is not a choice. It's the only path forward. For you. For your freedom." Tears welled in Elian's eyes, but they were not tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of overwhelming, heartbreaking gratitude. "And what about your freedom, Kale?" A small, sad smile touched Kale's lips. I've been a prisoner for a lot longer than you have, Elian. A prisoner of duty, of expectation, of being the second son. Breaking that door down, that was the first time I felt free. They packed nothing. There was nothing in this gilded cage that belonged to them. Elian left the beautiful clothes, the extravagant gifts, the entire curated life that had been built for him. He walked out wearing the simple, soft robe Kyle had given him. Kyle was in his bruised and battered trousers, a clean shirt borrowed from Reese's vast, empty closet. They were shedding their old skins. As they stood by the lift, Elian took one last look at the penthouse. At the nest in the middle of the floor, a monument to their shared ordeal. He looked at the shattered art, the broken door, the end of an era. Then he looked at the floor-to-ceiling window and saw his reflection. He was pale, exhausted, and wearing borrowed clothes. But his eyes were clear, and for the first time, he didn't see a specimen. He didn't see an asset. He saw himself. Alien. The ride down in the lift was a descent into a new world. They exited into the anonymous lobby and walked out into the city. The noise and the smells, the press of the crowd, were a shock after the sterile silence of the penthouse. It was chaotic and real. It was life. Kale's apartment was on level 12, deep in the city's humming heart. It was a small, functional space, with a window that looked out not onto a glittering skyline, but onto the wall of the adjacent building. It was cluttered with books and old tech manuals. It smelled of kale, of cedar and earth, and faint, clean ozone from the electronics he tinkered with. It was the most beautiful place Elian had ever seen. The legal proceedings began the next day. As Kale had predicted, Reese's lawyers contacted them with a cold, efficient proposal for a bond dissolution. The paperwork was sterile and brutal, outlining the mutual agreement that the mating bond had failed due to biological incompatibility and irreconcilable differences. It was a lie that told a deeper truth. They signed the papers in a cold, grey legal office, Reese appearing only as a remote hologram, his face an impassive mask. He did not speak to them. He simply affixed his digital signature and vanished. The final step was the biological severance. It was done in a medical clinic, a cold, painful procedure that involved hormonal suppressants and a targeted energy pulse to deaden the nerve endings around the mating mark. It felt like a surgical extraction, the cold wire of the bond being pulled from his soul. Elian cried out when it happened, a sound of pure loss and release. Kale was there, holding his hand, his presence a steady, warm anchor in the cold, clinical room. When it was over, the mark on his neck was just a faint, silvery scar, a memory. It no longer pulsed with that low, proprietary hum. It was silent. He was untethered. They walked out of the clinic into the artificial twilight of the lower city. They had nothing. Kale's accounts had been frozen, his inheritance voided. Elian's former life was a closed chapter. They were pariahs. They were free. They walked back to Kale's small apartment in silence. The world felt new, terrifying, and full of possibility. Inside, the silence felt different. It wasn't the heavy, waiting silence of the penthouse. It was a space to be filled. Elian walked to the small window and looked at the brick wall a few feet away. He could see a single, stubborn weed growing from a crack in the mortar. It was a tiny, defiant splash of green in a world of grey. He felt Kale come to stand behind him. He didn't touch him, but Elian could feel his warmth, his steady presence. "What now?" Elian whispered again. But this time, the question wasn't filled with fear. It was filled with wonder. "Now," Kale said, his voice a low rumble behind him. "Now is whatever we want it to be." Elian turned to face him. He looked at this man who had fought for him, protected him, respected him. This man who had walked through fire and given up everything. The pull between them was still there, a deep, resonant hum in his blood. But it was no longer a frightening, uncontrollable instinct. It was a quiet, steady certainty. It was a choice. He reached up and gently touched the faint, silvery scar on his neck. It was no longer a brand of ownership. It was a testament to his survival, a reminder of the cage he had escaped. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was Elian. And for the first time in his life, he was free to choose. He looked into Kale's stormy grey eyes, and in their depths, he saw his future. Not a gilded cage, but an open sky. He took a step forward, closing the small space between them, and rested his head on Kyle's chest, right over his heart. He felt Kyle's arms come around him, holding him not with possession, but with a quiet, reverent tenderness. He breathed in the scent of cedar and rain, and for the first time, it felt like home.